Hello, I'm Collen Yates, and I'm the CEO of Regional Development Australia Perth, and welcome to our show today. We have a very special guest. We have Peter Leahy. He's here to talk to us about a few things of defense interests, and he's the director of the National Security Institute. So welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Collen. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Retired Army officer,
Yep.
37-year career. Seemed to go by pretty quickly because I really enjoyed it. It was a privilege. So I finished up as Chief of Army in a time for Army when we were doing a lot of things. We were deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places across the globe.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it a real privilege to be able to be in that position. Retired in 2008 and went to the University of Canberra, where they were kind enough to make me a professor, which I'm still trying to understand what they mean by that. But I'm in a position there with the National Security Institute, where my passion is teaching.
Wow.
And I love teaching undergraduates and talk to them about national security in its broadest sense, that how do we live as a community, how do we live within our region, and what do we do as a global citizen. Talk to them about national interest and national power and some of the changing nature of conflict. And I also teach a subject there called the challenge of modern terrorism. And so I try and have a look at what the fundamentalists are thinking, examine their ideologies, and look in particular at some of the people that were writing out of Egypt in the 30s and the 50s to try and understand what terrorism means for us as a threat to our security. So I guess I range broadly across all of those, in part academic issues, but I hope what I do is I bring a practical side of that. I've been a practitioner. My job in Army was to raise, train and sustain the Army and to deploy them on operations. And so to me, the really big task was to make sure they came home alive.
Right.
That we gave them the equipment and the training and the capabilities that they needed to deploy overseas and come back alive and obviously do their mission and do it well. I also do a few other things. I'm involved with some charities, in particular Soldier On, which I have a real passion for, to look after wounded
veterans or?
Yeah, so wounded, injured and ill from our recent wars, and by that we mean East Timor and forward. Yeah. I'm involved with some other charities, but also some commercial organisations, so stock exchange listed companies, and probably in some ways bringing all this together. I've been on the first principles review of defence for the last 5 years.
Oh, wow.
And so we've done a major reform program inside the department as we look at the changing nature of security. David Johnson, Western Australian, who was then the Minister for Defence, asked us to make sure that defence was in a good position to spend wisely and effectively and efficiently the money, the very great amounts of money that are being put into defence at the moment. So an increase in our expenditure through a percentage of GDP from about 1.5% to 2%. And so we've been looking at the nature of defence, made some changes and reforms there. So I might have left the Army, but I'm still very much involved in defence and very much interested, even though I live in Canberra and I do some work for Queensland. I think we need to be thinking seriously about defence here in the West.
Fantastic. And with that, in 2017, RDA Perth released a report, Security and Defence in Western Australia, an economic perspective. And a lot of that was trying to see what we had here, and what it revealed was that there was little understanding about defence in Western Australia, but the importance of WA in terms of moving forward in the Indian Ocean region. So what are some of your thoughts around that?
Well, I think you're right. There's this lack of an understanding about defence in the West, and I travelled around a lot as Chief of Army. I'd visit bases and come over here fairly frequently. And what I found is, as I travelled around Australia, in different places people looked at defence in different ways. So on the East Coast it was that focus into the South Pacific, sort of look towards the United States and the West Coast, and look pretty well directly north through Papua New Guinea into Southeast Asia. You'd move up into Queensland, North Queensland, there's a slightly different look at it. Some of it was directed towards Indonesia. Into Darwin, it was very much directly north into Indonesia. And over here in the west, which I think really has been somewhat neglected in our strategic thought, that link into the Indian Ocean, but also obviously as we began our deployments into the Middle East, that look into the Middle East. And I think that's been consolidated by the way we now look at our geographic region rather than the South Pacific or Southeast Asia. We're talking about the Indo-Pacific region.
Yes.
And what struck me in about 2013, there was a Centre for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments out of the United States, and they made the assessment that Australia was in a geographic sweet spot in terms of we have a foot in both oceans, we have avenues of approach that look into the Indonesian sea lines of communications or by Selat Sunda Straits and so on. And so it's an important place. And I think that discussion is somewhat matured in that the Americans are looking at Australia as a training, as a support base, as frankly a base that would be out of range of some missiles that might perhaps be able to more easily interdict Guam and other bases that the US have. So I got interested in this in terms of, are we thinking about our strategic defence, about Australia as a whole? And I think we've somewhat neglected the West. Now, of course, we've got the Navy here, and about half the Navy fleet is here, and I think that's really important. The submarines are going to be based here. But if I look at it from, say, an Army point of view, there's really not much over here. Great quality in the Special Air Service Regiment, and you've got to love them. But this is half of the continent. Do we have an army for the West?
And that's a really interesting point, because in a lot of the conversations that we've had, everybody feels that if there were to be an event, let's say at the Northwest Shelf, that everything would be able to be deployed rather quickly and it'd be sorted. But when you start to drill down into that, it actually takes a few days, to get action and movement. And so one of the recommendations in our report was around increasing the Army presence in WA. What are your thoughts around that?
I'm somewhat persuaded by the argument, but probably not in the direct way that you see that. I think as a nation we need a larger army.
Yes.
So that's where I would start the discussion rather than saying that Western Australia needs more army. I would say, well, I think as an army, a national army, we need to be larger. If you look at the deployments over the last, 2001, 18 years since we went to Afghanistan, the army's been busy, and we expanded from about 2004 to 2010 from 25,000 towards 30,000, but it's still quite a small army. So, and given the tasks that we've got, so I would say a larger army, and I think more of that should be in Western Australia.
Yes.
And whether or not we've got the right force structure, and I'm probably going out a bit on a limb here, I think that something like an army brigade, some 3, maybe 4,000, a balanced force of combined arms, infantry, armour, artillery, engineers. We've got a very good reserve brigade in Western Australia, but they're not that readily available. They don't have the depth. And then the bit that's probably, people say, well, do we really need the Special Air Service Regiment here? Now, I know Perth is their home and they're very proudly West Australians, and Western Australia has supported them. But if I look at the potential for terror attacks, of course, Perth might be a target, but I think it's more likely to be in the east, where if you group the special forces, you get advantages for training and management of the resources and so on. So yeah, a larger army for Australia, and I think more of it over here in Western Australia.
Wow, that's interesting. So do you think Canberra is listening?
Oh, probably not. I'm not sure that Canberra listens, and I live there, but I'm not sure they listen too much to. I think they've paid note.
Yes.
But this is one of those sort of big moves that it's sort of almost, things like this only happen once in a generation.
Yeah.
So in my time, we moved a battalion of about 1,000 plus out of Darwin to Adelaide, and that went really well. So I don't think that it's impossible, but there would need to be a lot of thought given to it. There has to be part of a force structure review, and we had one in about 2011. It really didn't come to much. There were some good ideas, and one of them was we needed greater army presence in the northwest. And I think I heard a figure just recently about 43% of our exports come out of Western Australia.
Yes.
So are we actually protecting it? Are we in location? And can we take advantage of some of the things Western Australia has got in terms of geography? And armies these days need large areas to train in. And I mean very large areas because some of the new equipment.
Western Australia is very large.
You have plenty of territory out there, but I think from both a state and a federal government point of view, they should be saying, well, we better claim some of that.
Yes.
And the sorts of things I'm thinking of are for long-range artillery. And the ranges that we've got at the moment are for essentially Second World War artillery, which is 20 to 30 kilometres. Well, we're talking in excess of 100 kilometres. The need for electronic ranges, and what you need there is really no electronic emissions at all, so you can test your weapons and your equipment and your protective devices inside that. So let's have a think about where the ranges might be. Western Australia is very supportive of the military, and the military will come with families. They'll know the wives will want to work, or the partners will want to work. Kids will want to go to school. So it needs to be thought through, but why don't we just start the discussion? Don't expect anything will happen in a rush, but let's start the discussion.
I agree with you on that. And from what I've heard with the moving the Navy over, the families that have come over, they love living down and around that area in Perth, and so there's a lot to offer in this particular area.
And there sure is, and we've also got the Air Force here, and they do some terrific work around. It's training, and the Singaporean Air Force are here, and they do training as well. But there's a large part of that northwest that's pretty empty and
sure is.
Pretty vulnerable.
Very vulnerable. And I think that that sometimes the concern is energy infrastructure. Could always if people started to go for that, then that could be a real problem for WA and Australia.
Now there's a reserve unit up there, the Regional Force Surveillance Unit, but again, and they know the area and they do terrific work in terms of long-term surveillance, so that they know what's happening over a longer time frame. But I think more regular forces with the ability to know the land, to be able to work in the land, know how the climate works over here, because a lot of the northwest just shuts down. So we've got the right equipment for the wet season. It's probably not going to be vehicles, it's moving by small boats and small aircraft and so on.
That's correct. So in talking with the types of equipment and we're in a very rapid pace now of moving into Industry 4.0, where there's more automation. The technology is rapidly changing. Where do you see Western Australia in that space, and what it might be able to contribute to defence? Because we do have the shipbuilding here, but I think we've got a lot more to offer to the defence industries. And
I agree with you, and there are different levels of this, and obviously government's got a responsibility to get the best equipment, and I would say that's their primary responsibility. So the first thing to say is, well, some of this is going to come from overseas. And there's this debate about, well, what premium do we pay to make things in Australia? Well, yes, we need to have that discussion, but we start with the point, what's the best equipment for our soldiers, sailors and airmen? So some of that won't be made here. It won't even be made in South Australia, who seem to be doing pretty well out of this, or in Queensland, who I also support. But I think what we need to do is make sure that the local content is maximised when we're buying these sorts of things. And then we look at the need to be able to maintain it and sustain it over a very long period of time. And that should be done here in Australia. Now, at the moment, we send tank engines back to the United States to be repaired. Well, can we do that here? Maybe we can. So then we need to look at what sorts of industries can we develop, what are strategic industries, what do we need here in Australia in time of defence emergency. We're not going to be able to send stuff back overseas. So some of this really important stuff. So what are the priorities there? And then obviously there are Australian firms who are just doing gangbusters. They are exporting some of the stuff that goes into the aircraft, the Joint Strike Fighter, the new Rheinmetall Boxer vehicle that's coming out as part of Army Land 400, we can make bits of that here. And Rheinmetall are looking, they're encouraged by government obviously, but they're looking and they're finding that Australian small and medium enterprises can really produce. So I think we need to be encouraging that. So when you get to Western Australia, clearly they're pretty good at building ships, and look at the success of Austal into the United States, and they're just winning new contracts there now. They're very good at maintaining submarines and looking at building other things here. Then the maintenance and sustainment of vehicles, and then also training. Just how do you support some of the units that are here and the type of sophisticated training and the maintenance of some of this new high-tech equipment we're getting, the communications equipment, the drones and everything that goes with that. So I think there are real opportunities, but frankly, businesses, and this is some of my experience out of the first principles, is that at times it's not easy to do business with defence. It takes a while to set up. Writing a tender can be a real pain, and then, well, we need this and we need that. And most recently, what I'm seeing is the need for security.
Yes.
In that we've just had the Director General of ASIO talk to us about security. We've seen some of these hacking claims that are going on. There's also physical security and people infiltrating. And we now use words that have really only been part of war language, so espionage and sabotage. Well, that's what's going on, and we're hearing now that espionage is one of the biggest threats that we have.
Yeah, the technology is really amazing, and it's actually moving so quickly. Being able to keep up with it, and for instance, with the cyber security, just as quickly as you find a solution, somebody's found a new way to hack. So it is a little bit of a worry. And in terms of defense, I know that we've got some small to medium enterprises and some startups that have got some really, really great technology, and have felt very frustrated about the fact that it hadn't been taken up by Department of Defense or wasn't looked at by Australia, but the U.S. military has actually, So I think that's unfortunate. That we've got the smarts, we've got the intelligence, we're developing the technology, but we don't seem to take ourselves seriously enough.
I think that's a really good point in terms of, let me say, innovation.
Yeah.
And I think Malcolm Turnbull, a previous Prime Minister, I'm not sure how long ago now, but he talked about the innovation nation. And I think in some ways we're seeing that our industries are innovating quicker than the government.
Yes.
And I look at innovation really in two ways. It's not only the gadgets that you get, but how you use them.
The platforms.
Exactly. So I think we need to be thinking, how can we make government more innovative? And that's part of what this First Principles review has been. We've now got a new capability acquisition system. The service chiefs, so the Chief of Army, Navy and Air Force, are much more involved in that. So there's a greater sense of urgency and immediacy. And to Australian companies, I'd say just keep plugging away.
Yeah.
Value will be recognised, but at the same time, and as I said, I'm on a few boards, we're selling overseas as well. If the Australian government doesn't have the imagination or the ability to be innovative, well, company's got to survive, doesn't it? So let's look at taking it overseas and prove it there, and then it'll be picked up on the way back.
So in finishing, what do you think is Western Australia's greatest strength in terms of the future of defence?
Frankly, I think it's partly geography, because this is that bit that faces the Indian Ocean. When you look at some of the trade patterns that come out of the Straits of Hormuz up in the Middle East, the oil and other energy sources that move across the Indian Ocean, south of India and through the sea lines of communications, the Straits of Makassar and so on, and down the Malacca Straits. We're close to that. That's why we've got half the Navy here, so they can influence that. I think the ability for Western Australia, I did some work for South Australia as well, for Western Australia to be able to be that energy source.
Yep.
And I think we need to protect that, and we need to protect it naturally. Then this thought that, well, there is good industry over here, and it's been proven with the ships and so on. How can that be supported? The innovative thoughts, some of the work that's being done in the universities, I think is really important, whether it's in the science or some of the social science as well. How do we really develop our defence capabilities? Some of the thoughts around geostrategic positioning, and at that point I made earlier that people think about it differently over in the West, and I think we should be paying attention to that. And then obviously those young men and women of Australia who join the Defence Force, don't forget that's a real asset over here, and I've served with many of them. We're all Australians, but there's something special about people who come out of Western Australia.
Great. Well, thank you, Peter, so much for joining us today. And thank you to everyone out there for watching. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.